Welcome to the Quest for the Text, searching for the Bible's original words throughout the ages. Today is the second session, and we have the pleasure of learning with Dr. Gafni again. And with that, Dr. Gafni, good evening.
Okay, good evening. So I'm going to start with a brief review over what we've done in the previous session, and then we'll proceed for some new stuff. So here I'm sharing my screen. You see the screen? Okay, good. So what we were doing, I'll just remind you, the themes of this course we said in the previous session involve three B's, three themes that we're going to address in the course of this mini-series. The first thing we want to learn or find more stuff about the Bible itself, get to know a little bit more the different texts, the different variations or different versions of the biblical text. So one theme or one element of this course is about the Bible itself. The second B stands for the battles over the biblical text. We're also addressing battles between different religious communities over what was the original version of the Bible. So that's the second theme that we're trying to address in this course. And the third theme, the third B, involves the traditional learning in contrast to biblical criticism, or the gaps between these two. And we'll try to address the questions: how can we deal with the findings or the conclusions of scholars from a traditional perspective? How to make peace between, or if there's a way of compromising between the traditional and the critical way of viewing the biblical text. So we're addressing three themes, and as I said in the previous session, each class will be centering on, might be focused on one of those three themes more than the other, but eventually we'll address all three of them. In terms of the outline of the course, so in the previous session, again, I'm reviewing stuff we've done in the previous session. In the previous session, we addressed two terms that are common in Bible scholarship. The first thing is text witnesses, and the second one is textual versions of the Bible. So let me just review briefly what we've said about those two. When we talk about a text witness, that's what we mentioned last time, we're talking about a physical document, a document that we can hold with our two hands, something that has that is written on a certain material, a certain size, and we can talk about different physical features, where it was found and when was it put into writing. So all these are questions that we ask when we deal with a physical copy document, a text witness, or in our case, a text witness of the Bible. Textual versions of the Bible is an abstract concept. When we have many biblical text witnesses that share the same features, that resemble each other and form, we can talk about a family of a closely related texts, then we talk about them as a textual version of the Bible. In the previous session, we started by talking about the most ancient text witnesses of the Bible, meaning the most ancient physical copies of the Bible that survived. And we mentioned in this context, first, the priestly blessing that was found in Hinnom Valley in Jerusalem, which is dated to the 6th century BCE, perhaps the most ancient copy of the Bible that exists. We spoke briefly about the Nash papyrus that was found in Egypt. And finally, we said a few words on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those are the most ancient text witnesses of the Bible. And then we proceeded and we started speaking about one of the most important textual version of the Bible from the Jewish perspective, and that is the Masoretic text. We tried to characterize or describe this version of the Bible. We spoke about the number of books it includes, the way that they're divided. We spoke about its language. We spoke about the way we know how to pronounce the words and how do we determine the syntax of the sentence. And we also spoke about the most important text witness, physical copy that belongs to this family, the family of the Masoretic text, which is known as the Aleppo Codex. So this is what we've spoken about in the previous session. Today, we're going to talk about a new textual version of the Bible, the version of the Bible that was in use in Christian communities in antiquity, and that is the Septuagint. So the title of today's class is The Septuagint, a Tragic Tale. And in the course of today's class, what we will try to do is address a few themes that involve this new version or additional version of the Bible. So what type of questions are we going to discuss today? First, we will briefly define again what was the common version of the Hebrew Bible in the Christian community. And here I want to emphasize the entire lecture, although we're going to be discussing the text of the Bible that was coming in Christian communities, we are not talking about the New Testament. This course is about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to be talking about the version of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament that was being used by Christians in antiquity. So that's the title aspect. What was that version? We're going to talk about the features of this version of the Hebrew Bible. We'll also get to know the most important text witnesses, meaning physical copies of this version of the Bible. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about its history, its origin, and what did Jews and Christians think about this version of the Hebrew Bible. Did they assume it was 100% authentic? What thoughts did they have? What theories did they have about this version of the Bible? So 3 elements: title, facts, and theories, all involving the story of the Septuagint, So now you need to be ready. From now, we're going to start the actual class. That was just a preparation, review over what we've done, and some preparation for what we're going to do today. So we're starting with the title. As I said, what was the common version of the Hebrew Bible in the Christian communities in antiquity? So the answer is the official, authorized version of the Hebrew Bible among Christians many, many centuries back is known as the Septuagint. Why do we call the Septuagint the Septuagint? So the word Septuagint is in Latin, not in Greek, but rather in Latin, stands for the number 70. And as we will see later on, the title is based on an ancient tradition about 70 elderly men who took part in the translation project. And from then on, the translation was named as the Septuagint. So that's with regards to the title of this version of the Bible. Now we're going to try to give some facts. What are the features of this Christian version of the Bible? And for our purposes, it will be very crucial to emphasize in what ways is this version of the Bible different than the one that we knew, that we got to know last week, meaning the Masoretic text, the one that we are familiar with in the Jewish community. So we will try to describe different elements, such as the scope. How many books are included in this version of the Bible? How are they divided? What is the order or the sequence of the books in this version of the Bible? We'll talk about the language in which it is written, and about the consonants, pronunciation system, syntax. And finally, we'll talk about the most important text witnesses of this text. And later on, we'll also address the origin and some of the theoretical ideas that Jews and Christians had regarding this version of the Bible. So we'll do it step by step. And as we do it, we'll keep contrasting between this version and the Masoretic text. So we'll start with the basic questions: scope, division, and order. If you recall, and I'm happy if you want to say it out loud as we're doing it, or you can just listen. In the previous session, we spoke about the number of books that are included in the Masoretic text, or in the Masoretic version of the Bible. And we said that in the Jewish tradition, the canon includes a number of 24 books. These books, as we said, in the Masoretic text are divided into the Torah, the Pentateuch, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the prophets and the writing. We said that the classification between the 3 divisions of the Masoretic text are not so clear-cut. The rationale for dividing them, because it's not a chronological order, but it also does not follow different genres. And we also mentioned that the order of the books in the Masoretic text is not 100% clear. So what about the Septuagint? The first visible difference between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint involves the number of books. Whereas in the Masoretic text, we have only 24 books, the Septuagint includes about 35 books. In other words, there are about an additional 11 books that are part of the Septuagint that are not included in the Masoretic text. And I want to emphasize again and again and again, we're not talking about the New Testament. We're talking about the Old Testament, meaning books that have nothing to do with Christianity, that predate Christianity. In this canon, or in this version of the Bible, there are more books. How come? When the Bible was translated to Greek, it was translated in a place or in a time where some communities believed that there are more books that should be included as part of the biblical canon. And when the translation took place, it included also 11 more books, which made it into this alternative canon of the Bible. In the Jewish community that we're familiar with, these books were rejected. That's why in the Jewish tradition, they are called Sfarim Chitzonim, external books. But the Septuagint did include more books, and therefore the size or the scope of this canon is greater than the one that we're familiar with in the Masoretic text. The books that are included in the Septuagint and nevertheless are not part of the Masoretic text are called the Apocrypha. This is the title that we give for those additional books that appear in the Septuagint and that are not included in the Masoretic text. So that's already the first striking difference between the two versions of the Bible, these two textual versions of the Bible. In addition to that, the books are divided or classified in most editions of the Septuagint in a different manner. Unlike the Torah, Nevi'im, Ktuvim, prophets, writings, Pentateuch, prophets and writings, the Septuagint is divided into 4 categories. The first one is the legal component or the legal books, and that is parallel to the Pentateuch. Afterwards, we have books that are the historical compositions, and here you see the entire list. The names of the books that are underlined are additional books that do not appear in the Masoretic text, but appear in the Septuagint. So we start with the law, then we have historical compositions. Later on, you see here we have books that are both poetry and wisdom, poetry or wisdom literature. And finally, we have the texts that are belonging to what we would call the prophecy, Nevi'im. So we have not 3-part, but rather 4-part Bible. And the classification here is much more, is in a sense more clear because it involves the genre. Law, history, poetry, and wisdom. In other words, artistic type of books. And finally, prophecies. And again, the books that are underlined on the list are additional compositions. We're not going to elaborate on each one of them now, but just so you get a general sense. Also, the sequence or the order of the book within each category tends to be more chronological in the way that the Septuagint is found in most manuscripts and later on in printed editions. So when you talk about different versions of the Bible, the first thing or the most visible thing is just the size of the canon and the way it's divided. However, this is not the only difference between these two versions of the Bible. Even when we talk about the same text, about the text of identical books, we will still find big differences. So it's not just a matter of the size, what the size of the canon is, but also the identical books might have very, very big differences. And here we need to get to the second theme, which more technical theme that involves the language, pronunciation, consonants, syntax, all these questions. So we'll start with the language. The Masoretic text is a version of the Bible in the original language of the book, meaning it's not a translation. When we read the Bible in the Masoretic text in Hebrew, we are reading the book in its original language. The Septuagint is a textual version of the Bible that does not record the book in its original language, but only in a form of translation. So another big difference between these two different textual versions, that the Masoretic text is a version of the Bible in its original language, whereas the Septuagint is just a translation of the Bible, but it's not a book or it's not a version of the Bible that is recorded in its original language. The Septuagint is written in Greek, as you all know. However, so here you see, for example, the opening paragraph of the Sefer Bereshit. So this is the way it would sound in the Greek, and or it would appear in the Greek, and here you have the English translation of that passage. However, now this is a very important statement I want to make. The Septuagint is not a translation of the Masoretic text. It's not a translation of the same textual version. The Septuagint is a translation of a different version of the Bible. In other words, the person who translated, the people that translated this version of the Bible were doing it off a different version of the Hebrew text. They were working with a different Hebrew version of the Bible. They were not translating precisely the same text as the Masoretic text. So for that reason, we don't view the Septuagint as a translation, a Greek translation of the Masoretic text, but as a Greek translation of an alternative version of the Bible. That version of the Bible was different in many, many ways. There were thousands of differences between the original text of the Masoretic text, the original Hebrew text that served as the foundation of the Septuagint, in contrast to the one that we use in the Masoretic text. Okay, so that's a very important distinction. We're not talking just about a difference of an original versus translation, but it's a translation of an alternative text. How can we tell that? So this is true in many ways. When you take the Greek translation and you try to reconstruct or move back and try to guess what the original Hebrew sounded like, you often come to the conclusion that it's a different original text. What I'm holding now, what you also see on the screen, is a book called Targum HaShiv'im LaTorah. And the person who did this task, his name was Tzvi Karl, many, many years back. He took the Greek translation of the Septuagint and translated it back into Hebrew. And if you open the book, you will see that almost every page includes at least 10, 20 differences between our Hebrew version of the Bible, of Masoretic text, and what he thinks was the foundation, or what people call in German, the Vorlage of the Greek translation, the suggested Hebrew that was used as foundation of the Septuagint. We don't have that Hebrew anymore, but we do have a translation that is a reflection of an alternative Hebrew version of the Bible. And I want to talk about a few examples. So some differences involve the letters themselves, the consonants themselves. Through the translation, you can tell that the original Hebrew of the Septuagint was drastically different. And I want to bring you one example where the translation reveals or exposes a different original Hebrew. This text is, the text we're going to do now is from the book of Genesis in chapter 24. After Abraham's slave meets the Rebecca, he sees that she's the right match for Isaac, and then the Torah says, "Vayikod ha'ish, vayishtachu laHashem." Then the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord. We want to focus on the beginning of the text. The Torah says, "Vayikod ha'ish." Likod in English would mean to bow down. However, when you read the Greek, and I'm not going to read it in Greek letters, but in the English translation, what it would sound in English, it doesn't say that the man bowed down. It just says, and the man, being well pleased, worshiped the Lord. How did he get to the words being well pleased? He's obviously not talking about bowing down. So what does it mean, the man being well pleased? Scholars would suggest here that the Septuagint is working off an alternative Hebrew version. Rather than saying Vayikod ha'ish, the translation probably read Vayichad ha'ish. Vayichad is to be happy, just like we have in the story of Yitro, Vayichad Yitro. Yichad is to be happy. It seems like the translation here was working off an alternative Hebrew original version that read Vayichad ha'ish vayishtachu laHashem, and that's why he's translating it, and the man being well pleased worshiped the Lord. So here you see that this is not just a translation of the same text, it's a translation of an alternative version of the Hebrew Bible. Here we're talking about different consonants, but sometimes you would have the same consonants, but the pronunciation must have been different. The person who translated the text read the words, pronounced the same words in a different manner. And here I want to bring a very interesting, perhaps amusing example for this. Do you know a neighborhood in Yerushalayim, not too far from where I am now, that is called Mea Shearim? I'm sure you all been there in Mea Shearim. So Mea Shearim is named after a verse that appears in the Bible. What does the Bible say? In Sefer Bereshit, in Genesis 25:12, it says, "Vayizra Yitzchak ba'aretz hahi, vayimtza b'shana hahi mea she'arim, vayivarcheu Hashem." So Isaac, in English, people translate, Isaac sowed in that land, and repeat 100-fold the same year, and the Lord blessed him. So the words mea she'arim is translated here as 100-fold, something of that sort. However, if you will read, and that's why the neighborhood was also called afterwards Mea She'arim, because it was established in the same week of when the parsha was read. This parsha was read, and that's why the neighborhood was called Mea She'arim. However, if you read it in the Septuagint, you would see that they have a different formulation. They would read, or it translates, and Isaac sowed in that land, and he found in that year barley and hundredfold, and the Lord blessed him. Where did he get the barley from? Any ideas? I'm really giving you a big hint. He must have read one word differently.
Arim.
Right, rather than reading the word she'arim, the way we translate maybe gates or a hundredfold, he must have read this me'ah se'orim. Se'orah in Hebrew means barley. We have in other places in the Tanakh that people count a number of se'orim. Also in the Megillah of Ruth, shisha se'orim, it appears over there. So it seems like he was pronouncing the same word in a different manner. And if you would follow this pronunciation, you wouldn't call the neighborhood maybe Me'ah She'arim, but rather Me'ah Se'orim, maybe. And so this is an example where the translation reflects an alternative pronunciation. Sometimes when we're dealing with the translation of a name, the translation is not a translation, but rather a transliteration when it records a name. And then you can also see very easily that certain words were pronounced in a different manner. That's when we're talking about a transliteration of a word, not just a translation. But even the translation reveals an alternative pronunciation tradition that the Masoretic text, that of the Septuagint in contrast to the Masoretic text. So I'm once again emphasizing the Septuagint is not just a Greek translation of the same text. It's a canon, it's a larger canon, it's sorted in a different, it's divided in a different way, but even identical books are drastically different than the ones that we use in the Masoretic text. It's a translation, it's a Greek translation of a drastically different original Hebrew that we don't have anymore. It's considered a different textual version of the Hebrew Bible. What are the most important text witnesses of the Septuagint, meaning physical copies that survived from this version of the Bible? So in contrast to the Masoretic text, the situation here is actually much better. We have large copies of the Septuagint from much earlier than the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex, as I mentioned, is the beginning of the 10th century, maybe end of the 9th century. I think it's 930s, the year that appears in the book. But here we're talking about full copies, or at least large copies that include or cover big portions of the Bible from many, many centuries before. I'll give some names of important text witnesses, meaning physical copies, important copies of the Septuagint. So here you see a large copy of the Bible called Codex Sinaiticus, discovered in 1844 in Santa Catarina monastery near Mount Sinai in the desert. Currently, it's divided. This manuscript is divided into four parts in different places, and it dates to the 4th century CE. It covers about 390 pages of some estimated 800-page full copy, both Old Testament and New Testament. So we're talking about a fairly large copy that survived from 500 years earlier than the Aleppo Codex, at least. In addition to this full copy, we also have small fragments of the Septuagint from much, much earlier, what we would consider part of the Dead Sea Scroll world. This is a copy of a text from Nachal Hevel, also near the Dead Sea, that is dated to the 1st century BCE, approximately. You see the interesting word here, the arrow that points out to this word. It's a fascinating example that the whole text is in Hebrew. The whole text is in Greek letters, but when they put the name of God, they still use the ancient form of the original alphabet in alphabetic order, the Hebrew alphabet letters and not the Greek letters. That links to the stuff we were talking about, the ways that people used to write God's names also in Hebrew documents. Here you find another collection of a bunch of small, tiny fragments, 8 fragments that date to the 2nd century BCE, found in Fayum in Egypt. And this is one of the most important, perhaps the most ancient text witnesses of the Septuagint that are known up to this point. But again, these are tiny fragments. The full copies, 4th century and onwards, CE. So overall, the situation in terms of text witnesses is a much better case than in a much better state than in the case of the Masoretic text. So what have we done so far? We spoke a little bit about the name Septuagint and also about the important features that make this into a drastically different textual version of the Hebrew Bible. What I want to talk about now is a little bit about its history. It's the story of the Septuagint. And here, that will also pave the way for next class when we will start addressing the battles between Jews and Christians regarding the original text of the Bible. So where is the Septuagint from? Who composed it? So there's two ways to tackle this problem. If I were to ask you to write a paper on the origin of the Septuagint, so there are two ways of doing that. The hard way, the more difficult way perhaps, would be to take the Septuagint and to analyze the translation itself, and through the translation come to conclusion where could it have been translated, what time, what century more or less, by whom. That's one way of doing it. The other way is looking at Google and seeing what do external sources say about this text. So we're not going to look in Google now, or at least not in the 21st century Google, but we will look in and examine a few descriptions of that tell the story of the Septuagint that were composed many, many years ago, many centuries ago, shortly after the translation was put into writing. And what we will do here, we will see, we'll trace the story of this translation, and we will see that there's a very interesting twist or change or shift in the way that the story of the Septuagint is being told in ancient, and today we'll focus mainly on Jewish records, and we'll try to ask, why did that happen? So I'll start with a very basic outline. There's an ancient tradition that talks about a whole bunch of elderly people who were asked by some king, King Ptolemy, to translate the Bible for him. That's the common denominator. That's the part of the tradition that will keep appearing again and again and again. But there are many differences in the details here. So what I want to do now, this is an ancient piece of art. There's so many paintings of this event. You'll see it as the presentation goes. So what I want to do is as follows. We're going to examine 4 documents out of many, many more. There are many, many other Jewish sources. And they're sorted in a chronological order. We're going to start with the letter of Aristeas, 2nd century BCE composition that tells the story of the Septuagint. We'll move on to the text written by Philo from Alexandria. We'll proceed to the Babylonian Talmud a few centuries later, and we'll conclude with a passage from Tractate Sofrim, which is one of the minor tractates that people refer to them. And we will try to ask ourselves the following questions as we go. Number, meaning how many people took part in this translation project? Time, how much time did it take to produce this translation? And this is a crucial question. Goal, why did these people decide to translate the Bible into Greek? Whose initiative was it? Process, do we know anything about the method, how this translation was created? And finally, 2 other questions. Result, is the translation described in each of the sources as an accurate translation, or perhaps as a deviation from the original Hebrew? Finally, evaluation. How does each source view this story? Is this a happy story, a happy tale, or perhaps a tragic tale? So these are the questions we're going to try to answer as we read these texts. We're not going to find answers to each of these questions in each of the texts, but at least it's important to keep these questions in mind. And I'm avoiding addressing other questions that are just going to be too much for us to deal with now, but these are the crucial questions that are important to address in this survey. Okay, so the first text we're going to do is a text called the Letter of Aristeas. The Letter of Aristeas is a book that was composed by some Jew in Alexandria. We don't know so much about him. and it tells the story of how the Bible was translated into Greek. So what's the story that is being told there? There's a king, King Ptolemy, who has a gigantic library, and he wants to collect every possible book and have it be part of his library. So let's read a few passages from the letter. Demetrius of Phalerum, the president of the king's library, received vast sums of money for the purpose of collecting, as far as he possibly could, all the books in the world. I'm just pointing out a few decades ago, in Alexandria, they had an attempt to reestablish this library, this enormous library. By means of purchase and transcription, he carried out to the best of his ability the purpose of the king. On one occasion, when I was present, he was asked, "How many thousand books are there in the library?" 10, and he replied, "More than." This is verse 10. And he replied, "More than 200,000. There are more than 200,000 books. It's not a big library in modern terms. O king, and I shall make endeavor to, in the immediate future, to gather the remainder also, so that the total of 500,000 may be reached." So he's already talking about a very big library. Just think, we're talking about the 2nd century BCE. But in the process of creating this library, they realized that they're missing an important volume. They don't even have one copy of the Bible. I am told that the laws of the Jews are worth transcribing and deserve a place in your library. What does it prevent you from doing this? Replied the king. Everything that is necessary had been placed at your disposal. They need to be translated, answered Demetrius, for in the country of the Jews, they use a peculiar alphabet and speak a peculiar dialect. They're supposed to use this. Okay, we can skip about this. They're supposed to use a different dialect that they're not using. So the king understands that, and he orders a letter to be written to the Jewish high priest, and that his purpose might be accomplished. That's the way the story starts. And then he goes on and tells how these people can't come to Egypt. And we can go back to the chart for a second, and I'll tell you what parts appeared there. In the letter of Aristeas, we talk about 72 people who translate the Bible, 6 representatives of each of the 12 tribes. So we're talking about a number altogether of 72 people. How much time did it take? Any guesses? How many days? 72 days. Exactly the same number of people, also 72 days. Goal. Why did he try to do this? Why did he get into this project? So as we read, at least on a technical level, the king wants to have a copy of the Bible in his library. But if we want to present it in more broad or in more general terminology, I would say it comes from natural intellectual curiosity and need to know about. He's just fascinated by the fact that there's an ancient community out there that has a book that he's not familiar with. He wants to get a copy of the Bible. He wants to understand this tradition. In the letter of Aristeas, we have no record how this translation actually took place. It just says these people gather and they produce a translation. It does say, though, at the end that the translation was amazing. It was just a great piece of work. And therefore, they take an oath that nobody is allowed to change even one letter in the final product. Evaluation. Is this a happy story or a sad story? A happy tale, optimistic story, or pessimistic description? What would you say? I think when you read the story, you get an impression that this is a very happy event. It's a reflection of some non-Jew, some Gentile king who's fascinated by the Jewish laws and wants to learn more about the Jewish tradition. We're moving on. And again, there's a lot more to say on each of these sources. We're moving on. And the next source is written by Philo. Philo is another Jew from Alexandria. He lived from the year -20 to +50. So the end of the beginning of the Common Era. And he also writes a large description of the story of the Septuagint. Where does that appear in his book? Philo wrote form of, I would say, a philosophical type of biography of Moses, of Moshe Rabbeinu, called The Life of Moses. This is also written in Greek. And therefore, and in the course of this biography, he has to tell also something about the Torah. And he also tells how the Torah became known to everybody. We're going to focus on a few sentences, a few passages from his description, where he says the following words. He says as follows, therefore, again, he talks about, I should emphasize, he also starts with the king's fascination, of King Ptolemy's fascination to learn about the Torah, his request that people from the land of Israel would come and help him out with this translation process. And he goes as follows, therefore, being settled in a secret place and nothing even being present with them except the elements of nature, the earth, the water, the air, and the heaven, concerning the creation of which they were going in the first place to explain the sacred account. In other words, these people are sitting just out there in this beautiful place in nature, and they're about to start translating the story of the creation that also involves nature. And he goes on, and he says, they, like men inspired, prophesied, not one saying one thing and another, but every one of them employed the self-same nouns and verbs, as if some unseen prompter had suggested all their languages to them. He's coming up with a very fascinating addition. And this is something I want to address in a second. It seems from his description that we're talking about different people, individuals that are working independently. Later on, they're gathering together, and in some sort of miraculous way, they discover that they came out with the same result. Later on, he comes and he concludes it. Even to this day, there's every year a solemn assembly held and the festival celebrated in the land, in the island of Pharos, to which not only the Jews, but a great number of persons of other nations sail across, reverencing the place in which the first light of interpretation shone forth, and thanking God for that ancient peace. I can skip here, and after the prayers and giving thanks, some of them pitched their tents on the shore, and some of them lay down without any tents in the open air of the sand of the shore, and feasted with their relations and friends, thinking the shore at that time more beautiful abode than the furniture of the king's palace. So here we have certainly a very, very happy story, a very optimistic description. And again, I'm moving back to the chart. The Philo does not give the number of people who took part in this translation. He does not say how much time it took, but he does emphasize that it comes from the king's motivation to learn more about the Jewish Bible. The process, as I said a minute ago, separating the people into different rooms or to different places. The result, the beautiful translation, again, that should not be changed. Evaluation, it's a feast. It becomes a holiday. I just want to ask you one question. Why do you suppose that they separate the people into different rooms from his perspective? Why? What would be the advantage of doing such a thing? Why have them work independently? What would be achieved by that?
Otherwise,
Right. So it seems like he's trying to come with this ultimate translation. If they would work together, maybe some people are more dominant than others. So if you produce the translation by 70 independent people, you can compare and come up with the ultimate translation with the type of translation that perhaps conveys or manages to capture the essence of a text. So it seems that this is what is going on here. I know of a group of elderly people in my neighborhood that meet once a week, choose an English poem, they translate it into Hebrew, and they meet the following week to see who managed to get a better translation of that poetic piece. So in a sense, it's the same thing. We're talking about an attempt to come up with an ideal translation, and the best way of doing that is coming up with alternative options. However, as Philo says, they managed to come up with the same identical translation. So far, a happy story. But now we're moving on to a later description. You need just to know, Kyla, just tell me the time. I don't have a watch here. I just want to know that I'm not going over time or
It is 1:41. You have 20 more
okay,
minutes.
excellent. So we're doing great. Great. Now we're going to move into the Talmud Bavli and see what we find here. It's another description of the same text, of the same story. But here I think there seems to be a very clear change. The Talmud over there talks about the fact that the Bible was translated into Greek. It was permitted for people to translate the Bible into Greek. And the Talmud says as follows. This is in Masechet Megillah 9a into 9b. Why was the Torah why was it permitted to translate the Torah into Greek? So the Talmud says as follows. And this was due to the incident of King Ptolemy, as is taught in a Braita, in a Tanaitic text. There was an incident involving the King Ptolemy of Egypt, who assembled 72 elders from the sages of Israel and put them into 72 separate rooms and did not reveal to them for what purpose he assembled them, so that they would not coordinate their responses. He entered and approached each of and every one of them and said to him and to each of them and said to each of them, write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher. The blessed one, the Holy One, blessed be he, placed wisdom in the heart of each and every one, and they all agreed to one common understanding. Not only did they translate the text accurately, but they also introduced the same changes in the translated text. I think if you have a good ear, you sense that this is already a very different story. And the first thing that I think can strike our imagination, or can give us a sense that this is a very different story, is which element in the story that did not appear beforehand. In what way is this description very different than the ones we saw in the letter of Aristeas or in the text of Philo? There's one element in this description that is already very different. What is it? Any suggestions?
He seems to make sure that no one knows that anyone else is engaged in the same translation.
Exactly. He's not telling them in advance what this is all about. He's just putting them in separate rooms. Why would he do that? Why is he not telling them what this translation is all about? That on its own, I think, shows that this story is already being told in a very different way. The attempt to translate the Bible into Greek in this description seems to be rooted not in intellectual curiosity or fascination of the Jews, but rather in some suspicion. He's suspecting that perhaps some Jews are hiding something from him. Perhaps the Jews are not showing him or giving him or exposing all their ideas or all their secrets to different people. So he's asking them, translate this text to me, but you can't do it with after you as a group, because then you obviously hide all those problematic elements in the text. So I want each one of you to do it separately. Let's see if then you will manage to fool me or to cover the problematic parts of your religion. In a miraculous way, again, they managed to produce the same translation, but here too, there's a very big difference. Because the miracle in this description is not the fact that you come up with one identical translation. That seems to be a piece of cake. The point is that they managed to alter, to deviate, to change the text in one single form. So this is a story about a king that suspects the Jews for hiding something, for covering some problematic elements in their religion. And at the same time, Jews managed to fool him. They managed to get rid of all those problematic aspects of their religion. In the following passage that we're not going to read, in the continuation of this text, the Talmud records a whole list of changes or deviations that the elderly people have done, ways that they deviated from the original text. So it's very visible, I think, just by looking at this tradition, that something happened here. This beautiful, happy story suddenly looks a little bit like a tragic event. And if you are not convinced yet, so we'll move on to the next passage. And I think that will be even a stronger proof to show that this is what is going on here. this is another, again, all these are illustrations painting ancient paintings of this of the story of the Septuagint. This is from the 17th century. In Tractate Sofrim is a minor tractate. It's one of those small tractates that didn't make it into the Mishnah, and it's dated more or less the 6th, 7th century or so. In other words, it's a post-Talmudic text. In this text, we have two versions of that same story. We're going to address them. We're going to treat them as one, and as if this, and we'll assume that this is the same story that is just being told in two slightly different manners. In the first passage, it says, and it once happened that 5 elders wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy in Greek, and that day was as ominous for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made, since the Torah could not be accurately translated. Again, it also happened, and again, scholars treat this as an alternative version of the same story. It also happened that King Ptolemy assembled 72 elders and placed them in 72 separate rooms without telling them the reason for which he had assembled them. He then went to each of them and said to him, "Write me the translation of the Torah of Moses, your master." And the Hashgacha inspired them, and the mind of all of them was identical, so that each on his own wrote the same translation of the Torah, introducing the same 13 alterations. I think it's pretty obvious now that this is not a happy story. This tradition is already equating this to the day on which the golden calf was made. And the Jews are also emphasizing here, again, the elderly people were not informed before this translation process, and that they managed to create a translation that's drastically different than the original. Finally, this is not a part of the presentation, I want to point out, in Shulchan Aruch, our most important legal codex, there's actually a day that is a day of fasting. That is, it's in the calendar, there's one day designated that one needs to fast to remember the day in which the Torah was translated to Greek, somewhere in the month of Tevet, coming up soon. And the question I want to ask you, the obvious question I want to ask is, why? Why did this beautiful story about everybody wanting to learn about the Torah, why did this story about this feast that Philo was describing, how did the feast become into a fast? How did this holiday become into a day that we're supposed to mourn and try to remember as a tragic event in Jewish history? Why did the story change its nature? What could be the explanation? What could be the reason for this shift, the way the story is being told? Ideas. Scholars came up with many theories, but there's one very dominant approach, and I think that is probably the right one. Why did this story become, from this happy story, why did it become a tragic tale? What could be the cause for this?
A different relationship with Greek-speaking communities.
Okay. Before I give you the comment,
Was there a strong, two thoughts. One, maybe there was a strong tradition that the Tanakh should only be in Hebrew, and translating it is somehow sacrilegious, though I'm not sure why, because, I mean, nowadays, everybody reads it in translate. I mean, many people read it in translation. But also, by definition, when you translate, you've interpreted it in a certain way, and that can introduce changes.
Okay, but that would not explain why initially it was perceived as a happy day. If that's true, it should have been perceived as a tragic event from day one.
The Greeks were happy because now they could read it, but maybe the traditionalist Jews were not happy because they said, wait, we should never translate it, and it shouldn't have happened, but, Ptolemy forced us.
But I hear what you're saying, but I'm reminding you, the author of the letter of Aristeas is a Jew. Philo is a Jew. They're both Jews. They're operating in Egypt, but they're Jews.
Christianity?
Oh, so that's the word I was looking for. Many scholars assume, and this is I think the obvious answer, that something drastically changed. And the difference is not just geographically, which could also be part of the story. I'm not saying that it's not right what you're emphasizing, that these are different people writing, but it's probably also has to do with the timing. Initially, 2nd century BCE, it sounded like a great idea. Everybody wants to learn about the Jews. Everybody wants to be exposed to this unique ancient tradition. At that point, it probably sounded like a great thing from Jews. It would probably lead, it's like a great advertisement for the Jewish people if people will think of them highly of them. However, from the 1st century onwards, there was another religion that comes up. Christianity emerges, and Christians are not just an additional religion. They take over the Hebrew Bible. Christians, and this is a theme for another course, they take the Hebrew Bible and they interpret it as if this text is speaking about them, as if this text is about Jesus, about their own Christian beliefs. Not just the New Testament, even the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, becomes a Christian text. As soon as that happens, I can easily imagine that Jews probably felt, what a mistake we've done. By translating this text, we expose this text to everybody. It's as if you have a file that you put on the web. The moment you press enter, it's out of your control. And this is what the Jews felt. We translated this text, and now it becomes this universal book that anybody can read and interpret according to his own desire. He could read it and explain it as if it's speaking about him and not about us. As soon as that happens, Jews probably feel it was an awful mistake. And the tale is being told in a very different way. It's not a happy story. It's a tragic story. And the Jews also make one thing very, very clear. The Torah could not be accurately translated. They're making a very clear point. If you don't speak Hebrew, if you don't read this book in the original language, you don't really get it. That's what my wife told my kids when they read Harry Potter in Hebrew. She told them, if you read it in Hebrew, it's not the same thing. You have to read it in English if you want to appreciate the book. This is what the Jews are telling Christians. Okay, you have the copy of the book, but you don't read it in Hebrew. You don't really get the essence of this text. And there's a very interesting proof for this theory, which is, I think, almost obvious, from one of the Midrashim. In Midrash Tanchuma, it says this, it's not an actual historical description, but this Agadah comes up. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Shalom, maintained Moses desired to write down the oral law. At some point, Moshe wanted to record in writing the Torah Sheba'al Peh, maybe the Mishnah. But the Holy One, blessed be He, foresaw that in the course of time, you should read this in the original, in the Hebrew, to get the nuances. It belongs here. So Kadosh Baruch Hu saw that in the course of time, the nations will translate the written law and read them in the Greek language. So God knew this is not a good idea. Look what happened to the written law. Eventually, it was translated to Greek. And what do the nations do now? They would then assert, we too are Israelites. Hence, the Holy One, blessed He, told Moses, it's not a great idea to write down the oral law. Should I write him never so many things of my law? The result being, they, Israel, are counted as strangers. So this is an interpretation to a verse in Sefer Hosea. When you put things into writing, it means that everybody can take control over that text, and then it would not maintain the uniqueness or the fact that the Jews have a special relationship with God. This is a legend, but I think the legend is addressing precisely what we're talking about. It's talking about what happened to the Bible. It was translated to Greek, and now the nations say, we too are Israelites. This is not, you can't mistake this hint. This is talking about Christians who read the Bible and they say, we are Israel in spirit. Maybe from a genetic perspective, you're descendants of the original Jews, but we took over from a spirit in the spiritual sense. We are two Israelites. The Bible is speaking about us. That's what Christians are saying. As soon as that happens, Jews feel we're not going to put into writing the oral law, but they also probably regretted the fact that they put the Torah, they translated the Torah and basically lost control over this text. One last statement I'm going to make. Okay, Kyla, you have to tell me. I don't have a.
Yep, you've got 5 more minutes, so
Okay,
time
great.
for one more statement.
So one more way of showing that this is indeed the case is examining Christian records of the story of the Septuagint. And you can predict how Christians tell the story. Would they view this as a tragic event? from their perspective, it's going to be a very happy story. And we have many records, not just one, but more than one record of Christians telling the story of the Septuagint. And I chose the one that is perhaps the most extreme. This is written by Augustine, one of the church fathers, in his book, The City of God. And look what he says. Tradition tells the following story. He's giving the entire description of the story of the translation of the Bible. And then he says the following part. To test their trustworthiness, Ptolemy had them tackle this task each in solitary confinement, which when they had finished, it was discovered that in their versions, they had arrived at a wonderful, indeed stupendous, and obviously divinely inspired in the choice of their words, that they were in agreement of each word. I'm skipping all these parentheses, and in the order of the words they chose, all gave one translations as if they were but one translator, because in truth, the Holy Spirit was at work in all. God gave them this marvelous gift so that the authorship of Scripture would seem to the Gentile divine and not human, and so that in time they would believe in and profit by them. We have lived to see this realized. I think what's fascinating here is that he adds one thing to the story. He's emphasizing again and again and again, this is divinely inspired. God was there. Why is it so important for him to make that point? What he's trying to say, he's responding to the Jewish argument. Jews were probably telling Christians, you are not reading this in the original. You're not getting the full essence of the text. We read God's words. You're reading some translator's work. By saying that God was there, and this is visible through this miracle that they're coming up with the same translation, Christians are trying to say, this work is just as good as the original. True, it's a translation of the Bible, but it's with God's approval. God is there, and he's telling us, is indicating this is not anything less than the original piece of work. It's divinely inspired. God was at work. Nobody can tell us you can't understand the Bible if you don't read it in the original Hebrew. This is as good as the original. This is not the only record. There are other descriptions of the story of the Septuagint among other Christian authors, and they're not speaking precisely in the same tone, but this is pretty extreme, and I think it gives this impression very clearly. These were external testimonies or descriptions of the translation. I just want to conclude that when we analyze the translation itself, it's also very clear that it was produced by Jews, because certain translations show resemblance to Jewish interpretations of certain elements of the stories. But also scholars conclude, unlike this legend, that it was actually not translated by the same people that came to one similar translation, because the translation differs in different books. Let's say the word kiseh. Can you say the word kiseh in English in 5 different ways?
Seat, chair.
Chair, seat, bench, I don't know, stool. So if you would have the same word appear in different places in the Bible in different ways, it would be translated the same word kiseh in different places, in different manners. It indicates that it's not the same translator. At least it seems that it's not the same person translating, because one person probably would be more consistent. So for that reason, scholars assume that it was actually not done by one person. Perhaps different books were translated by different people. But it's certainly a Jewish translation, and it certainly comes from Egypt around the 2nd century BCE. So that part is also something we can prove from the translation itself. Whether this was a happy tale or a negative tale, that part is left for our own speculations. Next week, so we're done with this part, and next week we're going to start talking about the comparisons between these 2 versions of the Bible, and also we'll start addressing the battles between Jews and Christians on who had the original text of this book. So you'll have to wait patiently for next week.
Thank you. Can I just say, I'm so sorry I got to listen to everything and it was magnificent. I'm sorry I was in my car, but I appreciate it so much.
All right, and I'm happy to give a few minutes for questions, just because I know it was pretty fast-paced. Rafael? Thank you for joining us for the 2nd session of the Quest for the Text. All right, good night. good afternoon,
Thank you.
good morning,
Which
depending on where you're
class
turning
has
in
been
from.
postponed?